Please be seated. We've all faced grief in some form, losing loved ones, experiencing sudden changes, or struggling with life's many uncertainties. And when we explore the contours of grief, we discover, or maybe are schooled in, the cycle of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. These stages, originally identified by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, may help us name the difficult feelings that loss brings. In denial, grief often feels unreal. We may go through the motions, completing tasks just to avoid the hard truth. Life no longer makes sense, and there's an impulse sometimes to pretend nothing has changed. As reality sinks in, though, anger often rises. Maybe anger at God, maybe at the circumstances, and even sometimes at ourselves. It's the natural reaction to a wound that feels unhealable. We may ask, why did this happen? Or why them? Or why me? In bargaining, we seek answers or meaning, hoping to restore what we've lost. Then depression follows when we realize that we cannot change what has happened. Over time, we do reach acceptance, a place where memories bring comfort rather than pain, where we start to move forward, though forever marked by the loss we've endured. Initially, we probably learn that these stages of grief are ordered and neat, like a well-written recipe. But as we grow older, it becomes obvious that the journey of grief is more like a roller coaster than a kiddie ride. Each person's journey through grief is unique, a mix of moving forward and circling back, of feeling stuck or surprising ourselves in moments of joy. Eventually, we come to understand that there is no right way to experience grief, except that we must go through it. There is no avoiding grief forever. Yet grief, though painful, reminds us of the depth of our love. The Rabbi, Dr. Earl Groman, taught, grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. Love is the root of our grief. It's what gives grief its power, even though it's difficult to bear. And grief, of course, is not only about death. Every significant change in our lives can bring a sense of loss. We grieve relationships when they end, whether through breakups or distance. We grieve the loss of health when illness or injury changes our lives. And grief happens in communities too, witnessing the struggles of social justice, watching changes in beloved places, and being there, seeing the suffering of the world. Every time our reality shifts, we find ourselves navigating grief to some degree or another. If we accept the old proverb that nothing is permanent except change, we must learn to live with grief, because grief is part of what makes us human. And if grief is part of being human, then Jesus, too, experienced it. In the story of Lazarus, Jesus comes to the tomb feeling the deep sorrow of Mary, Martha, and the others grieving their friend. John's gospel tells us Jesus wept. This was no quiet shedding of tears. He openly weeps, moved by sorrow. What was Jesus grieving that day? His friend? The delay in his journey? The pain his loved ones were enduring? Perhaps he grieved for a world marked by suffering and loss. Or perhaps, as we often learn, all of the above. When love and grief are intertwined, as they certainly were for Jesus, we understand that his grief must have matched the depth of his love. Jesus didn't mourn only for Lazarus. He wept with all who suffered, reminding us that God is deeply moved by our pain. It's not hard to find examples of how Jesus' own journey also echoes the stages of grief. Knowing the cost of his ministry from the first day, Jesus' whole journey was always to the cross. Was it shock and fear that drove him into the wilderness? Does he not get angry and frustrated when both his disciples and the crowds don't understand? What does Jesus ask when he says, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me"? What does he pray for in those final moments as he falls to his face in the Garden of Gethsemane? Yet Jesus' journey did not end in death. It led to resurrection. Christ's victory over death, offering believers the hope of eternal life. Death is no longer the end, but just a passage to a new, transformed life with God. And what is eternal life if not returning to the very source of love, the beginning and the end of love? Grief is powerful, but love is greater still. And what we see in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is that God's love is stronger than death itself. As we say in the burial service, "For your faithful people, O Lord, life is changed, not ended." Through Christ's victory over death, we know that our lives continue in a new form, in a union with God that death cannot break. Reflecting on the death of a friend, the Reverend Aaron Jean Ward writes, "This faith is the tender reminder that they are not ended, but changed. This mirrors our love for one another because death does not end our love for them or their love for us. But the way they love us and the way we love them is changed. It has different contours. It takes a new form. The way they love us and the way we love them is resurrection itself, the persistent life that will not be shrouded in death. Our love for one another even beyond death, gives us a glimpse of resurrection, an everlasting life that refuses to be bound by the grave. And throughout our lives, our grief reflects our love for one another, for our families, for our friends, and for our communities. Grief is woven into the fabric of life because love is. Jesus, who loved so deeply, also grieved deeply. Yet in his resurrection, he shows us that love endures beyond death itself. The love we hold for those who have gone before us is just a glimpse of the resurrection. A love that cannot end, only reshape. Our faith offers us comfort in knowing that through Christ, love is eternal, and we are held together by a bond that transcends even the grave. It's cradled in God's love that we can find the strength to grieve, the courage to hope, and the promise of a life that endures.